On June 26 to 28, 2022, the leaders of the world's 7 advanced economies met in Germany. They pledged economic assistance to Africa and other developing countries once more. However, the fulfillment of these commitments is contingent on political developments in the group of 7, G7, countries, specifically the United States, the outcome of Russia's war with Ukraine, and whether Russian President Vladimir Putin retains power. It's impossible to predict how each of these political developments will play out. However, each has a significant impact on the decisions African leaders must make regarding which power blocs, if any, they will align with. The G7 is made up of 7 of the most advanced economies: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Every year, the country holding the G7 presidency invites partner countries to attend parts of the summit. The foundational purpose of the G7 Group Forum of Industrialized Countries, of which Germany, West Germany then, is a founding member, was an intervention in global financial and economic governance. The forum first met in 1975 to discuss and take pertinent resolutions on the worldwide economy and the global financial architecture, such as responses to the oil, a fossil fuel, crisis in the early 70s and the exchange rate changes resulting from the U.S. departure from the gold standard in 1971. Similar to today, these decisions were of great significance and had a lasting impact on the other 188 countries in the global economy, most of which were, at the time, newly independent, some affected by armed conflict, and had little to no industrial capacity, poor economically but rich in raw materials. While the G7 heads of state represent only 10% of the global population and almost 40% of global GDP, their decisions can have a lasting impact on various global matters. The many pressing economic issues arising from the Ukraine war dominated this year's agenda, particularly the scope and effects of Western sanctions against Russia. This year's summit was also framed by concerns about Donald Trump's potential re-election in 2024. Trump's administration was seen as a Putin supporter who questioned the need for a G7 summit. President Joe Biden, on the other hand, is a fervent supporter. However, Biden has domestic political insecurities, raising the prospect of Trump's return or the election of someone with his nationalist views in 2024. This was the backdrop for this year's G7 summit, to which South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and Senegal's Macky Sall, the current chair of the African Union, were invited to make presentations. So were the leaders of India, Indonesia, and Argentina. Each is a democracy with strong ties to G7 members. African governments, in particular, face numerous challenges as tensions between Western democracies, Russia, and China rise. Africa's interests would be best served if its leaders avoided being drawn into the hostile divide between Russia, China, and the West. However, it may be impossible to avoid taking sides while attempting to maximize advantageous partnerships. Political uncertainties abound among the major powers, including the outcome of the Ukrainian war, U.S. domestic politics, and even Putin's grip on power. The Russian president has been in power since 2000, and he has amended the Russian constitution to extend his term until 2036. In 2024, Biden will face disgruntled voters, with current polling data showing his support at less than 40%. The summit's host, Germany, was successful in having Western economic issues related to the Ukraine war discussed on the first day. The second day focused on the issues confronting African and other developing countries. Climate change, global health, gender equity, and digital infrastructure were among the topics covered. All of these issues are currently affected by the Ukraine war. Its disastrous consequences for Africa must not be overlooked. In terms of the summit's worth, the summit provided the most recent insights for Africa into how the Western advanced nations are thinking about their stakes in Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impact that could have on developing countries. It will take time to separate substance from rhetoric. Africans are right to be skeptical of the West's ability to deliver. For key political possibilities could advance or derail African governments as they assess the significance of the G7's promises of support in areas of critical concern to Africans. If Putin remains in power and Biden wins a second four-year term, the chances of a second Cold War in Africa increase. This would likely differ from the first in that there would be less of a military confrontation and no competing ideologies of communism and capitalism. Rather, it would be about varying degrees of democracy and authoritarianism, posing difficult choices for African governments and citizens. If Putin stays but Biden loses to the still dominant Trump faction Republicans in the 2022 congressional and 2024 presidential elections, America's commitment to the G7 package could be terminated in 2025. In 2017, Trump revoked the U.S. pledge to support a special fund to mitigate the effects of climate change. Other cuts to multilateral programs that Biden restored, such as those to the World Health Organization and African peacekeeping, would almost certainly be reinstated. And, if Trump allies gain more power in Congress, they will be less able to protect programs in health, agriculture, and development that Trump failed to cut during his first Trump presidency. If Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are preserved, Putin is deposed or politically weakened, and Biden wins, the risks of a new Cold War in Africa should diminish and opportunities for collective African agency should improve. If both Biden and Putin lose power at home, the chances of a new Cold War in Africa diminish. The focus will turn more towards China and whether the G7 can function as an equally important partner in Africa's collective efforts to improve the daunting prospects of its myriad challenges without America's leadership. With South Africa and Senegal attending the G7, it is important to reflect on the G7's history and purpose, especially given the global economy's economic challenges. Any African perspective on the G7 summit must take into account the G7 member states' colonial and neo-colonial history with Africa. There has never been any doubt that third world countries, many of which are in Africa, want to develop and transition from being net recipients of so-called aid to becoming self-reliant net providers of innovations and solutions to the challenges and problems that confront them and the rest of the world. Colonialism, underdevelopment, inequalities, and poverty have been and continue to be a major global crisis that has dragged on for centuries, exacerbated in Africa by exclusion from global value chains, persistent illicit financial outflows, and worsening threats from pandemics and climate change, among other challenges. Africa has warned that it has a significant infrastructure gap that must be filled in order for the African Union's AU 15 flagship projects to catalyze an African renaissance. The G7 has a current and historical obligation to assist by leveraging their financial commitments to Africa. A reminder that, despite contributing only 3% of global emissions, Africa is already dealing with the unaffordable effects of climate change on infrastructure, communities, and livelihoods, driving further inequality. The G7's first three fossil fuel-powered industrial revolutions, combined with colonialism, arguably allowed them to grow exponentially in technological, social, military, and general economic prowess, but at the expense of the environment and climate. With little sustainable development of any of its economies, post-colonial Africa has effectively been a net provider of the materials required for this advancement. As a result, there is structural global inequality and poverty, as well as a climate crisis that has a significant impact on global economic stability. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, defined by technological advancements that characterize current and future human endeavors, has arrived. However, this revolution occurs at a time when climate impacts necessitate a different path for economic development. With Africa lagging far behind industrially, a significant infrastructure gap, unending illicit financial outflows, and limited access to advanced technologies, some still expect a just transition to be accepted by all and move smoothly with successful outcomes. Genuine G7 development partnerships have been scarce. This refers to investment and partnerships that would spark the sustainable industrial growth and development in Africa that the AU is promoting in its Agenda 2063. African leaders are right to be skeptical of these alliances. For example, the G7 failed to provide meaningful assistance with vaccine access and other measures to mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic on Africa and its people. Furthermore, the G7 and G20 committed to reallocating $100 billion in special drawing rights, SDRs, from a total of $650 billion to assist IMF member countries facing economic crises. To date, African countries have received approximately $33 billion. In comparison, the United States received $113 billion, and the $100 billion that African countries desperately need has yet to be reallocated. The G7 has made numerous so-called aid promises to Africa. For decades, G7 leaders have pledged to devote 0.7% of their respective countries' GNI to international aid to help Africa and other continents in need. However, the G7 countries did not even come close, with a total contribution of 0.32%. Any development assistance that ignores Africa's post-colonial challenges in trade, food sovereignty, and energy sovereignty will only exacerbate the continent's economic problems. The G7 summit will pass, as have many others. The question is whether the G7, led by Germany, will turn years of talk into meaningful, just, and long-term action. Thanks for watching. If you like this type of content, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more stories.